Two titans of Rome stood on the brink of destiny. One would rise as an emperor, the other would fall into oblivion. This was not just a battle. It was the moment the Republic died. But before we dive into this epic clash that changed the world forever, let me ask you something personal. What would you do if your closest ally became your deadliest enemy? How far would you go for power? Would you risk everything you've built, everything you believe in, for one final throw of the dice? These are the questions that haunted two of history's greatest men as they prepared to face each other in mortal combat. You see, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great weren't always enemies. In fact, they were once so close that Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey to seal their political alliance. They were partners, friends even, ruling Rome together as part of the legendary First Triumvirate. But power has a way of corrupting even the strongest bonds. And by August 9th, 48 years before Christ, everything had changed. On that fateful summer day, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great faced off in the dusty plains of Pharsalus, Greece. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly as two massive armies prepared for what would become one of history's most decisive battles. The fate of Rome? No, the fate of the entire Western world hung in the balance like a sword suspended by a thread. Here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Caesar was outnumbered almost 2-1. His soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and far from home. By every logical measure, he should have been crushed. Pompey had the larger army, better supplies, and the backing of Rome's most powerful senators. He had every advantage you could possibly imagine. Yet somehow, someway, Caesar would emerge victorious. But the real question isn't just who would win. It's what this victory would cost the world. Think about it. This single battle would end the Roman Republic that had stood for nearly 500 years. It would pave the way for the Roman Empire, change the course of Western civilization, and set in motion events that we're still feeling the effects of today. One battle, one day, one decision, and everything changed forever. Who would emerge victorious from this clash of titans? What brilliant tactical move would Caesar pull from his sleeve? And what would it mean for the world when the dust finally settled? Want to know how this battle changed the course of history? Stay with us until the end. And don't forget to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more fascinating discoveries. Like, share, and hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible tale of ambition, betrayal, and the price of absolute power. Now, to understand how we got to this moment of destiny, we need to go back about 7 years earlier and talk about one of the most fascinating and ultimately doomed political alliances in history. Picture Rome in the year 59 before Christ. The Republic was creaking under the weight of its own success. Vast territories stretched from Britain to Egypt, but governing this massive empire was becoming nearly impossible. The old system of checks and balances was breaking down, and into this chaos stepped three of the most ambitious men who ever lived. They called themselves the First Triumvirate, though they kept their alliance secret at first. Think of it as the ultimate backroom deal that would change the world. On one side, you had Julius Caesar, brilliant, charismatic, but politically isolated and desperately in debt. Then there was Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, the man who had conquered more territory than anyone since Alexander the Great. And finally, Marcus Licinius Crassus, quite possibly the richest man in history, so wealthy that he once said a man couldn't call himself rich unless he could afford to raise an entire army. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about this alliance. These three men couldn't have been more different. Caesar was the smooth-talking politician, always one step ahead of his enemies. Pompey was the war hero, loved by the people but awkward in politics. And Crassus? He was the businessman, the guy who made his fortune by buying up burning buildings in Rome at rock-bottom prices, then sending in his private fire brigade to save them. Talk about a cutthroat entrepreneur. For a while, this unholy trinity actually worked. They carved up the Roman world like a pizza. Caesar got Gaul, where he would make his name conquering the barbarian tribes. Pompey got Spain and control of Rome's grain supply. Crassus got Syria and the promise of military glory that had always eluded him. But here's the thing about power-sharing agreements between ambitious men. They're built on sand. The cracks started showing almost immediately. Each man was constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if the others were plotting against him. The alliance was held together by mutual benefit, not trust, and that's a recipe for disaster. Then came the year 53 before Christ, and everything fell apart in the most spectacular way possible. Crassus, desperate to match the military achievements of his partners, launched a disastrous invasion of Parthia, modern-day Iran. At a place called Carrhae, his army was completely annihilated by Parthian horse archers. Legend says that when Crassus was captured, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his legendary greed. With Crassus dead, the delicate balance of the triumvirate shattered like glass. Suddenly, it was just Caesar and Pompey, two alpha males circling each other like lions. The third wheel that had kept them in check was gone, and the friendship that had once bound them began to crumble. Making matters worse, Caesar's daughter Julia, Pompey's beloved wife and the personal bond between the two men, had died in childbirth just a year earlier. Without that family connection, the political became deeply personal. Meanwhile, Caesar was off in Gaul, winning victory after victory, accumulating wealth and loyalty from his battle-hardened legions. Each triumph made him more popular with the Roman people, but it also made the Senate more nervous. They started whispering, "What happens when Caesar comes back? Will he be content to retire quietly, or will he want more power?" The Senate, those elderly aristocrats who had ruled Rome for generations, made a fateful decision. They threw their support behind Pompey, betting that his reputation and resources could contain Caesar's ambitions. It was like choosing sides in a divorce between two people you used to have dinner with every week. By the year 50 before Christ, the writing was on the wall. The Senate demanded that Caesar disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen, where he would almost certainly face prosecution from his political enemies. Caesar countered with a reasonable compromise. He'd give up his command if Pompey did the same. After all, they were both extraordinarily powerful generals. Why should only one of them be forced to become vulnerable? But Pompey, perhaps feeling secure in his alliance with the Senate, refused. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. And that's when Caesar made the decision that would echo through history. On January 10th, 49 years before Christ, he led his 13th legion to the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. By Roman law, no general could cross this river with his army without declaring war on the Republic itself. Caesar stood there for hours, his officers and men watching, waiting. The fate of Rome hung in the balance. Cross the river, and there would be no going back. Stay in Gaul, and he would likely face exile or death at the hands of his enemies. Finally, as dawn broke over the Italian countryside, Caesar gave the order. "Alea iacta est," he reportedly said. "The die is cast." With those 3 words, he stepped across the Rubicon and plunged Rome into civil war. What happened next would determine not just who ruled Rome, but what kind of state Rome would become. The republic that had stood for nearly 5 centuries was about to face its greatest test. And it all led to that dusty plain in Greece where 2 former friends would meet in mortal combat, with the fate of the Western world hanging in the balance. Now here's where our story takes a dramatic turn that almost ended Caesar's legendary career before it reached its peak. You see, after crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had moved with lightning speed through Italy, winning victory after victory. His momentum seemed unstoppable. Pompey, caught off guard, had retreated across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, taking with him the entire Roman treasury and most of the Senate. But if you thought Caesar was going to have an easy time of it, think again. What happened next at a place called Dyrrhachium would prove that even the greatest military minds can be brought to the brink of disaster. Picture this. It's the spring of 48 years before Christ, and Caesar has followed Pompey across the treacherous waters of the Adriatic. But here's the thing. Caesar was walking into what was essentially Pompey's home turf. The Eastern Mediterranean was Pompey's power base. He had allies everywhere, unlimited supplies flowing in from across the region, and most importantly, he had time to prepare. When Caesar landed in Greece with his battle-hardened but exhausted legions, he found himself facing a nightmare scenario. Pompey had positioned his massive army near the coastal city of Dyrrhachium, modern-day Albania, and he had every conceivable advantage. His forces numbered somewhere around 45,000 men compared to Caesar's 22,000. But numbers weren't even the real problem. Here's what made Pompey's position so brilliant. He controlled the sea. Roman fleets loyal to Pompey dominated the waters, meaning fresh supplies, reinforcements, and food were constantly flowing into his camp. Meanwhile, Caesar's men were stuck in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies, with their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Now, you might expect Caesar to do what any reasonable general would do: retreat, regroup, maybe try to find better ground. But Caesar wasn't any reasonable general. Instead, he did something so audacious it still makes military historians shake their heads in amazement. He decided to lay siege to Pompey's army. Think about that for a moment. Caesar, outnumbered 2-1 in enemy territory with no reliable supply lines, decided to trap Pompey's larger, better-supplied force behind massive fortifications. It was like David deciding to put Goliath in a headlock. The engineering feat that followed was absolutely incredible. Caesar's legions, those same men who had conquered all of Gaul, began constructing what would become known as the Lines of Dyrrhachium, a massive double wall of fortifications that stretched for over 15 miles around Pompey's position. The outer wall faced outward to protect against relief forces, while the inner wall trapped Pompey's army against the sea. But here's where things get really interesting. This wasn't just about military engineering. It was a battle of personalities and strategies that revealed everything about these two legendary commanders. Pompey, you see, was naturally cautious. He'd earned his reputation through careful planning and overwhelming force. His nickname wasn't the Great for nothing. He'd conquered more territory than almost anyone in Roman history. But he'd done it methodically, step by step, never taking unnecessary risks. Some of his officers were practically begging him to attack Caesar's thin lines while they were still under construction. "We outnumber them," they argued. "We could crush them right now." But Pompey held back. He figured time was on his side. Caesar's men were starving, cut off from supplies, while his own forces were well-fed and comfortable. Why risk a battle when starvation would do the work for him? It seemed like the smart play. Caesar, on the other hand, was all about speed and audacity. While his men built their incredible fortifications, he was constantly probing for weaknesses, launching surprise attacks, trying to force Pompey into making a mistake. But for once, Caesar's usual tactics weren't working. The siege dragged on for months, and his situation was becoming desperate. Here's a detail that really brings home how dire things were getting. Caesar's soldiers were so hungry they were making bread out of roots and grass. Some ancient sources say they were eating a plant called chara that was normally used as cattle feed. When some of this bread was thrown into Pompey's camp, his soldiers were reportedly horrified at what Caesar's men were willing to endure. But Caesar knew something that Pompey didn't quite grasp. His legions weren't just soldiers, they were fanatics. These men had followed him through 8 years of brutal campaigning in Gaul. They'd shared his victories, his wealth, and his vision of conquest. They would literally rather die than disappoint him. The crisis came when Pompey finally decided to act. Using his naval superiority, he managed to establish a beachhead behind Caesar's lines, essentially turning the siege inside out. Suddenly, Caesar found himself trapped between Pompey's main force and this new threat from behind. What followed was one of the most desperate battles of Caesar's career. His men, weakened by months of near starvation, were caught off guard and fighting on multiple fronts. For the first time in his legendary career, Caesar's tactical genius seemed to have abandoned him. His formations broke, his men fled, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like the great Julius Caesar was about to become just another failed general. The retreat that followed was a masterpiece of military discipline under pressure. Despite their defeat, Caesar's legions didn't collapse into a panicked mob. Instead, they conducted what military historians call one of the most skillful withdrawals in ancient warfare. Caesar himself reportedly moved among his fleeing men, grabbing them by the shoulders, turning them around, rallying them to make one more stand before continuing the retreat. Here's what's absolutely remarkable about this moment. Lesser men would have been broken by such a defeat. Caesar had lost nearly 1,000 of his precious veterans, men he couldn't replace. His reputation for invincibility was shattered. His enemies were probably already planning victory celebrations. But Caesar didn't surrender. He didn't negotiate. He didn't even pause to lick his wounds. Instead, he did something that would define his character for all time. He adapted. Within days of his defeat at Dyrrhachium, he was already planning his next move, looking for the battle that would turn the tide of the war. As his battered army marched inland through the mountains of Greece, Caesar supposedly told his officers, "Today the victory would have been the enemy's if they had a commander who was a conqueror." It was a typically arrogant Caesar comment, but it also revealed his mindset. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the end of the first act. Pompey, for his part, had won the greatest victory of the Civil War. His cautious strategy had finally paid off. But here's the thing about being cautious. Sometimes it becomes a habit. Instead of pursuing Caesar's defeated army and finishing the war, Pompey hesitated. He'd won the battle, but he wasn't sure how to win the war. That hesitation would prove to be the most costly mistake of Pompey's life, because Caesar wasn't retreating. He was regrouping. And somewhere in the hills of central Greece, he was planning the comeback that would change the world forever. After his defeat at Dyrrhachium, Caesar found himself in what military experts would call an impossible situation. His army was battered, his supplies were running dangerously low, and he was deep in enemy territory with winter approaching. Any rational commander would have tried to negotiate, maybe seek terms, perhaps even consider surrender. But Caesar had never been rational. That's what made him so dangerous. As his army limped through the Greek countryside in the summer of 48 before Christ, Caesar was doing what he did best, turning disaster into opportunity. While Pompey's supporters were probably already planning victory parades, Caesar was studying maps, calculating distances, and formulating what would become one of the boldest strategic gambles in military history. Here's what Caesar understood that others didn't. Time was both his greatest enemy and his only weapon. Every day that passed, his situation got worse. His men were hungry, his war chest was nearly empty, and Pompey's reinforcements were streaming in from across the Mediterranean. But Caesar also knew something else. Pompey's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. You see, Pompey had gotten comfortable with his advantages. He had the larger army, the better supply lines, the support of Rome's establishment. His strategy was beautifully simple. Follow Caesar at a safe distance, avoid major battles, and let starvation do the work. It was the smart play, the cautious play, the play that any military academy would teach. But Caesar was betting everything on a different kind of calculation, a psychological one. Think about this for a moment. Pompey had spent months watching Caesar's army slowly deteriorate. He'd seen them reduced to eating grass bread, witnessed their defeat at Dyrrhachium, observed their desperate retreat. In Pompey's mind, Caesar was finished. All he had to do was wait. Caesar, meanwhile, was orchestrating what might be history's greatest bluff. Despite his army's condition, despite his desperate circumstances, he began acting like a man who held all the cards. He started sending messages to neutral cities, demanding they choose sides. He moved his army with purpose and confidence, as if he had some secret plan that guaranteed victory. The genius of this approach was that it played perfectly into both men's personalities. Pompey, naturally cautious, started second-guessing himself. Why is Caesar acting so confident? He must have wondered. What does he know that I don't? Meanwhile, Caesar's own men, seeing their commander's unwavering confidence, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really did have a plan to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But here's the thing about psychological warfare. It only works if you can back it up with action. And that's where Caesar's next move becomes absolutely crucial. In early August, Caesar made a decision that stunned everyone, including his own officers. Instead of continuing to retreat toward friendly territory, he suddenly turned his army around and began marching toward the plains of Pharsalus, where Pompey had established his latest camp. His officers were probably thinking he'd lost his mind. "General," they might have said, "we just lost a major battle. Our men are exhausted and hungry. Pompey outnumbers us almost 2-1. Why are we seeking a fight we can't win?" But Caesar understood something that military textbooks often miss. Sometimes the most desperate situation calls for the most audacious response. He knew that if he kept retreating, if he kept playing Pompey's waiting game, his army would eventually disintegrate. Soldiers would desert, allies would switch sides, and the civil war would end not with a bang, but with a whimper. So Caesar made the ultimate gambler's choice. He would force a decisive battle before his situation became completely hopeless. It was all or nothing, winner takes all, the fate of Rome decided in a single afternoon. The psychological effect on both armies was immediate and dramatic. Caesar's men, seeing their general march confidently toward battle, began to remember why they'd followed him through 8 years of conquest in Gaul. These weren't just any soldiers, they were Caesar's veterans, men who had witnessed his tactical genius time and again. If Caesar wanted a battle, they reasoned, he must have a plan. Pompey's reaction was more complex. Part of him was probably relieved. Finally, he could use his numerical advantage to crush Caesar once and for all. But another part of him must have been deeply uneasy. Why was Caesar seeking battle when he should be running? What trick did the master tactician have up his sleeve? The days leading up to the battle were filled with fascinating psychological maneuvering. Caesar, despite his desperate circumstances, continued to project supreme confidence. He reportedly told his men that this would be the battle that would end the war and make them all rich beyond their dreams. Meanwhile, he was probably praying to every god in the Roman pantheon that his bluff wouldn't be called. Pompey, for his part, found himself trapped between conflicting pressures. His advisors, particularly the senators who had fled Rome with him, were pushing for immediate battle. "We have him," they argued. "This is our chance to end Caesar's rebellion once and for all." But Pompey's military instincts told him that something wasn't right. Caesar was too confident, too eager for battle. It felt like a trap. Here's a fascinating detail that really shows the tension of the moment. Ancient sources tell us that both armies could see each other across the plains of Pharsalus for several days before the battle. Can you imagine the psychological pressure? Thousands of men on both sides, staring at their enemies, knowing that soon they would be fighting for their lives and the future of Rome. The night before the battle, both commanders faced their greatest test of leadership. Caesar had to convince his hungry, outnumbered men that they could achieve the impossible. Pompey had to reconcile his cautious instincts with the pressure to finally end this war. According to historical accounts, Caesar spent that final evening walking among his men, talking to individual soldiers, reminding them of their past victories, promising them glory and wealth if they could just win one more battle. These weren't speeches to masses of troops. These were personal conversations with men who had bled for him in Gaul. Pompey, meanwhile, was dealing with a different kind of pressure. The senators in his camp were already dividing up Caesar's properties, planning their revenge against his supporters. They were so confident of victory that they were more concerned with what would happen after the battle than with winning it. But confidence and cockiness are two very different things. Caesar's confidence was born from desperate necessity and absolute commitment. Pompey's supporters were confident because they assumed victory was inevitable. One of these attitudes would prove far more dangerous than the other. What do you think could have been done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments and smash that like button if you're enjoying the story so far. And don't forget, subscribe to Imperium Chronicles. As dawn broke on August 9th, 48 years before Christ, two of history's greatest military minds prepared to settle their differences the only way they knew how, with bronze and blood on a dusty Greek plain. One man's career would end that day. The other would go on to reshape the world. The question wasn't just who would win, it was what kind of world the victor would create. The morning of August 9th dawned clear and hot over the plains of Pharsalus. As the sun climbed higher, you could practically feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Two massive armies faced each other across a field that would soon be soaked in blood, and the fate of the entire Western world hung in the balance. Let me paint you a picture of what Caesar was facing that morning. Pompey's army was a thing of beauty, at least from a military perspective. Nearly 50,000 men arranged in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, their standards fluttering in the breeze. These weren't just any soldiers either. Many were experienced veterans, but they also had fresh reinforcements from across the Mediterranean. And here's the kicker. Pompey had over 7,000 cavalry, an absolutely massive advantage in ancient warfare. Caesar's army, by contrast, looked like the underdog story of all time. 22,000 men, many of them gaunt from months of short rations, their equipment worn from years of campaign. But here's what Pompey couldn't see from across that field. These men had something his army lacked. They had absolute, unshakable faith in their commander. Now, conventional military wisdom said that Caesar should have deployed his forces defensively, maybe try to hold a strong position and hope for the best. But Caesar had never been conventional, and this morning he was about to prove why his tactical genius was legendary. As both armies moved into position, Caesar did something that must have confused the hell out of Pompey's observers. Instead of the traditional 3 lines of infantry that every Roman general used, Caesar appeared to be forming only 2. His first line consisted of his most experienced cohorts, his second line held his reserves. It looked almost thin. But here's where Caesar's genius becomes apparent, and this is the detail that military historians still study today. Caesar had created a secret 4th line, hidden behind his main formation, where Pompey's scouts couldn't see it. He'd taken about 3,000 of his most battle-hardened veterans, men who had fought with him through every campaign in Gaul, and positioned them as his ultimate reserve. Here's what makes this so brilliant. Caesar knew exactly how Pompey was going to attack. See, Pompey's greatest advantage was his massive cavalry force, and everyone knew he would use it to sweep around Caesar's right flank and attack from behind. It was the obvious move, the smart move, the move that should have won the battle. But Caesar was counting on it. Meanwhile, Pompey was dealing with his own command issues. Remember those senators I mentioned earlier? The ones who were already dividing up Caesar's property? Well, they were right there on the battlefield, breathing down Pompey's neck, demanding immediate action. "Attack now!" they kept saying. "Why are we waiting? We outnumber them!" This political pressure forced Pompey into making decisions that went against his better military judgment. Instead of using his numerical advantage to steadily grind down Caesar's forces, Pompey felt compelled to seek a quick, decisive victory, and that pressure would prove to be his undoing. The battle began with the traditional exchange of javelins and arrows. Thousands of projectiles darkened the sky as both armies tested each other's resolve. The noise must have been incredible, the clash of metal on metal, the shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men. But this was just the warm-up act. The real drama began when Pompey launched his cavalry attack exactly as Caesar had predicted. Led by Titus Labienus, ironically one of Caesar's former lieutenants who had switched sides, nearly 7,000 horsemen thundered around Caesar's right flank. It was a magnificent sight, and for a moment it looked like the battle was already over. Caesar's cavalry, vastly outnumbered, put up what appeared to be token resistance before retreating. Pompey's officers probably thought they were witnessing the beginning of a rout. Labienus's cavalry swept forward, ready to attack Caesar's main army from behind and end the civil war in one devastating charge. And that's when Caesar sprang his trap. Those 3,000 veterans he'd hidden behind his lines, they suddenly appeared as if by magic, moving with the disciplined precision that had conquered Gaul. But here's the absolutely crucial detail. Caesar had given them specific instructions that were completely unorthodox. Instead of using their swords in the traditional slashing motion, Caesar had ordered his men to thrust upward at the faces of Pompey's cavalry. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. A cavalry charge depends on momentum and intimidation. Horses and riders thundering forward, confident in their superiority. But suddenly, these highly trained infantrymen are stabbing at their faces, threatening to scar them for life. Ancient sources tell us that Pompey's cavalry, faced with this unexpected and terrifying tactic, simply broke. These weren't cowards. These were experienced warriors, but they'd never encountered resistance like this. Instead of the easy victory they expected, they found themselves facing determined infantry who seemed to know exactly how to neutralize their advantage. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Labienus's cavalry charge, which should have been the decisive moment of the battle, collapsed into chaos. Horses reared, riders fell, and what had been a disciplined military formation became a panicked mob. But Caesar wasn't done. The moment Pompey's cavalry broke, Caesar's hidden fourth line didn't just stand there celebrating. They immediately pivoted and began attacking Pompey's main infantry line from the side. Suddenly, Pompey's soldiers found themselves fighting on two fronts, Caesar's main army in front of them and these fresh reserves attacking from their flank. Here's where you can see the difference between a good general and a great one. A good general would have been satisfied with repelling the cavalry charge. Caesar saw it as an opportunity to win the entire battle in one stroke. The effect on Pompey's army was catastrophic. These men had been confident in their numerical superiority, sure that their cavalry would deliver victory. Instead, they watched their elite horsemen flee the field in panic. The psychological shock was almost as damaging as the physical attack. Pompey himself, watching from his command position, must have felt his world collapsing around him. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. His greatest advantage had become a liability. His confident soldiers were wavering, and Caesar somehow, impossibly, was winning. What followed was one of the most complete military collapses in ancient history. Pompey's infantry, caught between Caesar's frontal assault and the flank attack from his reserves, began to break apart. Unit cohesion dissolved, officers lost control of their men, and what had been Rome's most powerful army became a mob of frightened individuals thinking only of survival. The rout, when it came, was swift and merciless. Pompey's men threw down their weapons and ran. Some tried to surrender, others fled toward their camp, still others scattered across the Greek countryside. In the space of a few hours, the largest army in the Roman world had simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. And Pompey, the great Pompey Magnus, conqueror of the East, Rome's most celebrated general? He tore off his commander's insignia, mounted a horse, and fled the battlefield like a common soldier. The man who had once stood alongside Alexander the Great's tomb and declared himself the equal of history's greatest conqueror was reduced to a fugitive, running for his life across the plains where his dreams had died. Caesar's victory was so complete that he reportedly lost fewer than 200 men, while Pompey's casualties numbered in the thousands. But more than the numbers, it was the manner of the victory that shocked the ancient world. Caesar hadn't just won, he'd made it look easy. As the sun set over Pharsalus that evening, Julius Caesar stood master of the Roman world. The republic that had ruled for nearly 5 centuries lay in ruins at his feet. But this was just the beginning of his story, and Pompey's flight to Egypt would lead to an even more dramatic conclusion to their rivalry. What happened after Pharsalus reads like something out of a Greek tragedy: betrayal, murder, and the inevitable march toward absolute power. If you thought the battle itself was dramatic, you're not prepared for what came next. Pompey's flight from the battlefield was just the beginning of his nightmare. Picture this. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of kings and senators across the Mediterranean was now a desperate fugitive with a handful of followers, scrambling to find somewhere, anywhere, that would take him in. His first instinct was to head for Egypt, where the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII owed him a debt. Years earlier, Pompey had helped restore the boy's father to the throne. And surely that would count for something now, right? It seemed like the smart move. Egypt was rich, powerful, and far enough from Caesar to provide safety. But here's where the story takes a turn that would make Shakespeare weep. When Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast near Alexandria, Ptolemy's advisors faced a terrible dilemma. Should they welcome Rome's former champion and risk Caesar's wrath, or should they play it safe and stay neutral? The decision they made was as cold-blooded as it was calculated. Ptolemy's chief minister, a man named Pothinus, came up with what he thought was a brilliant solution: kill Pompey and present his head to Caesar as a gift. That way, Egypt would be on the winning side, and Caesar would owe them a favor. On September 28th, 48 years before Christ, Pompey stepped onto a small boat that was supposed to take him safely to shore. Instead, it carried him to his death. Among the men waiting for him was Lucius Septimius, a Roman centurion who had once served under Pompey in his campaigns. As the boat reached shallow water, Septimius drew his sword and struck down the man who had once been called the Great. The irony is almost too bitter to believe. Pompey the Great, who had conquered more territory than any Roman since the legendary days of the early Republic, was murdered by one of his own former soldiers on a beach in Egypt, far from the Rome he had served his entire life. But here's where the Egyptian plan backfired spectacularly. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he didn't thank his hosts, he wept. Whether those tears were genuine grief for his former ally or theatrical performance, we'll never know. But Caesar's reaction was swift and terrible. He had Pothinus executed and made it clear that Egypt would pay dearly for this act of treachery. You see, Caesar understood something the Egyptians didn't. Pompey's death actually made Caesar's position more difficult, not easier. As long as Pompey was alive, Caesar could present himself as defending his honor against unjust persecution. But with his rival dead, murdered no less, Caesar became something more dangerous, the undisputed master of Rome with no one left to check his power. The civil war wasn't quite over yet. Pompey's sons and other die-hard Republicans continued to resist for several more years. Caesar would spend the next few years chasing down the last remnants of opposition across North Africa and Spain. But after Pharsalus, the outcome was never really in doubt. Caesar had crossed a line that no Roman had crossed before. He had made himself indispensable. When Caesar finally returned to Rome in 46 before Christ, he was granted powers that would have made the founders of the Republic roll over in their graves. He was made dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency period, but for 10 years. Later, that would be extended to life. He controlled the armies, the treasury, the courts, everything that mattered in Roman governance. But here's what's fascinating about Caesar. He was too smart to just declare himself king. Romans had a deep-seated hatred of monarchy dating back to the expulsion of their last king over 4 centuries earlier. So Caesar played a more subtle game. He accepted divine honors, put his image on coins, and gradually accumulated all the powers of a king while refusing the title itself. The changes he implemented were actually quite popular with ordinary Romans. He expanded citizenship, reformed the calendar — we still use a version of his calendar today — launched massive public works projects, and generally made life better for the common people. But the old aristocratic families, the ones who had run the Republic for generations, watched in horror as their world disappeared. And that's where the story takes its most famous turn. You know what's coming, don't you? The Ides of March, March 15th, 44 years before Christ. A group of senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, decided that the only way to save the Republic was to kill the man who had destroyed it. The assassination itself is one of history's most dramatic moments. Caesar, warned by soothsayers to beware the Ides of March, walked into the Senate House anyway. When he saw the conspirators approaching with daggers drawn, his last words were reportedly, "Et tu, Brute," and "you, Brutus." The betrayal by Brutus, whom Caesar had treated almost like a son, was the cruelest cut of all. But here's the ultimate irony of the whole story. The conspirators thought they were saving the Republic, but they actually finished what Caesar had started. His assassination plunged Rome into another round of civil wars that would last for over a decade. When the smoke finally cleared, it wasn't the Republic that emerged. It was the Roman Empire under Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus. Think about that for a moment. The Battle of Pharsalus didn't just decide who would rule Rome for the next few years. It set in motion events that would shape the next 1,500 years of Western history. The Roman Empire that emerged from Caesar's victory would go on to spread Roman law, Roman culture, and eventually Christianity across 3 continents. Without Pharsalus, there might never have been a Roman Empire. Without the Roman Empire, Western civilization as we know it might never have existed. The languages we speak, the laws we follow, the very concept of republican government, all of it traces back to that dusty plain in Greece where Caesar's tactical genius changed the world. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the whole story is this. The Roman Republic that died at Pharsalus was already dying before the battle was fought. The system of government that had worked when Rome was a city-state couldn't handle governing a Mediterranean empire. The old checks and balances had broken down under the weight of conquest and wealth. Caesar didn't destroy the Republic so much as he delivered the final blow to something that was already mortally wounded. The question wasn't whether the Republic would survive, it was what would replace it. And thanks to Caesar's victory at Pharsalus, the answer was empire, not chaos. The senators who killed Caesar thought they could turn back the clock, restore the old ways, bring back the republic of their grandfathers. But you can't unbreak an egg, and you can't undo a historical transformation as profound as the one that began on the plains of Pharsalus. The world had changed, and there was no going back. So why should we care about a battle fought over 2,000 years ago on a dusty Greek plain? Because the echoes of Pharsalus still reverberate through our world today, teaching us lessons that are as relevant now as they were when Caesar's legions first clashed with Pompey's forces. Let me start with the military genius that unfolded that day. Caesar didn't win because he had more soldiers. In fact, he was dramatically outnumbered. Pompey commanded around 47,000 men, while Caesar had barely 22,000. But here's the thing that military academies still teach today. Numbers don't always decide the outcome. Speed, flexibility, and clever deception can topple even the mightiest army. Caesar's secret weapon wasn't some fancy Roman technology. It was his ability to adapt on the fly. When Pompey's cavalry threatened to crush his right flank, Caesar didn't panic. Instead, he had quietly positioned a hidden 4th line of his most experienced veterans behind his main battle formation. These weren't just any soldiers. They were hand-picked veterans who had followed Caesar through Gaul, men who would die for their general without question. When the moment came, Caesar unleashed this surprise force like a dagger thrust to the heart. Pompey's cavalry, confident in their superiority, suddenly found themselves facing fresh troops they never saw coming. It was a masterclass in military deception that generals study even today. The lesson? Sometimes the smallest, most unexpected move can change everything. But the real genius wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Caesar understood something that Pompey, for all his experience, had forgotten. Wars are won in the minds of men as much as on the battlefield. While Pompey hesitated, weighing his options, Caesar acted with lightning speed. His soldiers felt that confidence, that unshakable belief in victory, and it became infectious. Modern military strategists call this the Caesar effect, the ability of a leader to project such confidence that their forces fight beyond their normal capabilities. It's why Special Forces units today still study Caesar's campaigns, looking for that perfect balance of audacity and calculation. Now let's talk about the political lessons, because this is where Pharsalus becomes eerily relevant to our modern world. The battle wasn't really about military might. It was about a power struggle that had been brewing for years. Caesar and Pompey had once been allies, part of that famous political partnership with Crassus, known as the First Triumvirate. But power has a way of corrupting even the strongest friendships. Sound familiar? Throughout history, we've seen this same pattern repeat itself. Political allies become bitter enemies when the stakes get high enough. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's growing popularity with the common people, chose to back Pompey instead. They thought they were preserving the Republic, but they were actually sealing its doom. Here's what's fascinating. Both men believed they were fighting for Rome's future. Pompey genuinely thought he was defending Roman traditions and the authority of the Senate. Caesar believed he was bringing necessary change to a corrupt system. Both were probably right. in their own way. But that's the tragedy of civil war. Good people on both sides end up destroying the very thing they're trying to save. The betrayals that followed Pharsalus read like a modern political thriller. Pompey, desperate and defeated, fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary. He thought his past services to Rome would earn him refuge. Instead, the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII had him murdered the moment he stepped onto Egyptian soil. Why? Because he calculated that Caesar would reward Egypt more for delivering his enemy's head than for harboring his rival. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly political loyalty can evaporate when power shifts. Today's ally becomes tomorrow's liability with frightening speed. But perhaps the most important legacy of Pharsalus is what it taught us about leadership and the price of ambition. Caesar's victory that day set him on the path to becoming Rome's first emperor in all but name. He crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, from defender of the Republic to its destroyer. Here's what many people don't realize. Caesar probably never intended to become a dictator when he first crossed the Rubicon. He genuinely believed he was saving Rome from corrupt politicians and foreign threats. But power has its own momentum. Each victory demanded another. Each crisis required more authority, until Caesar found himself holding absolute power over the known world. The lesson for modern leaders is sobering. How many politicians start their careers genuinely wanting to serve the people, only to find themselves years later making compromises they never thought they'd make? How many business leaders begin with noble intentions, only to discover that staying competitive requires increasingly questionable decisions? Caesar's rise shows us that good intentions aren't enough. The road to tyranny isn't always paved with evil plans. Sometimes it's built with small compromises, emergency powers that become permanent, and the gradual erosion of democratic norms. Each step seems justified at the time, but together they lead to a destination no one intended. And here's the most chilling part. Caesar was actually a pretty good emperor. He reformed the calendar, expanded citizenship, launched massive public works projects, and brought peace to a war-torn world. Romans loved him for it, but the Republic was still dead. The system of checks and balances, the tradition of shared power, the idea that no one person should rule Rome, all of that died on the plains of Pharsalus. The senators who later assassinated Caesar on the Ides of March thought they were restoring the Republic. Instead, they just opened the door for Caesar's heir, Augustus, to become the first official Roman emperor. The Republic was already dead. They just hadn't realized it yet. So what does Pharsalus teach us about leadership today? First, that true leadership isn't about accumulating power. It's about knowing when to give it up. Caesar's fatal flaw wasn't his ambition. It was his inability to step back when the moment was right. Second, it shows us that institutions are fragile things. The Roman Republic had survived for nearly 500 years, but it only took one generation of ambitious men to destroy it completely. Democracy isn't self-sustaining. It requires constant vigilance and people willing to put principles above personal gain. Finally, Pharsalus reminds us that every decision has consequences that ripple through history. When Caesar made that split-second choice to position his hidden fourth line, he wasn't just winning a battle, he was reshaping the entire future of Western civilization. The Roman Empire that emerged from Pharsalus would influence law, language, architecture, and government for the next 1,500 years and beyond. Every leader today, whether they're running a country, a company, or just a small team, is making decisions that will echo through time. The question isn't whether our choices will have consequences. It's whether we'll have the wisdom to foresee them and the courage to choose correctly, even when the stakes are impossibly high. That's why Pharsalus still matters. Because somewhere out there, another ambitious leader is facing their own Rubicon moment, and the lessons of Caesar and Pompey might just help them choose a better path. And so we come to the end of our journey through one of history's most pivotal moments. But before we part ways, let me leave you with something to think about as you go about your day. Pharsalus was more than just another ancient battle where Romans killed Romans on a distant plain. It was the precise moment when Rome made a choice, perhaps without even realizing it, to trade its 500-year-old freedom for the promise of empire and order. On that August morning in 48 before Christ, when Caesar's weathered veterans clashed with Pompey's larger army, something died that could never be brought back to life. Caesar's victory that day proved something both remarkable and terrifying, that sometimes the entire course of human history can pivot on a single day, a single decision, a single moment of genius or folly. Think about it. If Pompey had positioned his cavalry differently, if Caesar had hesitated instead of committing his hidden reserves, if just one small tactical decision had gone the other way, we might be living in a completely different world today. But here's the haunting question that keeps historians awake at night. At what cost? Caesar won everything he wanted that day. He broke his rival, secured his power, and set himself on the path to reshape the Mediterranean world. Roman legions would march from Britain to Mesopotamia, Roman law would govern hundreds of millions of people, and Roman engineering would build monuments that still take our breath away 2,000 years later. Yet in winning everything, Caesar lost something precious that Rome would never recover: the Republic, that beautiful, chaotic, argumentative system where power was shared and no one man could rule absolutely, died at Pharsalus. Oh, it took a few more years to finally breathe its last, but the killing blow was struck on those Greek plains when Caesar's fourth line crashed into Pompey's flank. You know what's truly chilling? Most Romans probably didn't even notice at first. Life went on, the markets stayed open, the gladiator games continued, and people went about their daily business. But something fundamental had shifted. The idea that citizens could govern themselves, that power belonged to the people and their representatives, that no one was above the law, all of that became just a beautiful memory. Caesar himself might have been shocked to learn what he had unleashed. Remember, he spent his entire career claiming he was defending the Republic, not destroying it. He genuinely believed he was saving Rome from corrupt politicians and foreign enemies. Even as he accumulated more and more power, he probably told himself it was temporary, that he would restore proper government once the crisis passed. But that's how freedom dies, isn't it? Not usually with dramatic declarations and evil manifestos, but with small compromises, emergency measures that become permanent, and good people making what seem like reasonable decisions under pressure. Caesar's path, from defender of the Republic to its destroyer, is a masterclass in how gradually we can lose the things we hold most dear. Here's something that might surprise you. We actually have Caesar's own words about what he was thinking during those crucial moments at Pharsalus. According to the historian Plutarch, Caesar looked out over the battlefield before the fighting began and said to his officers, "Today, we fight not just for victory, but for the future of Rome itself." He was right, though perhaps not in the way he intended. And what about Pompey? As he fled the battlefield that day, watching his dreams of glory crumble in the dust, did he realize he was witnessing the end of an age? Pompey had once been Rome's golden boy, the general who had conquered the East and brought unimaginable wealth back to the capital. But power is a fickle mistress, and she had chosen a new favorite. The saddest part of Pompey's story isn't even his death on that Egyptian beach. It's that he died believing he had failed his country. He never understood that the game was rigged from the start, that the forces unleashed by decades of civil war had made Pharsalus inevitable. Someone was going to win absolute power. It just happened to be Caesar instead of him. But here's where the story becomes more than just ancient history. The past whispers warnings to the present, if we're wise enough to listen. Every generation faces its own version of the choice that Rome made at Pharsalus. Do we preserve our freedoms even when they're messy and inefficient, or do we trade them for the promise of security and strong leadership? It's a choice that echoes through the ages. In times of crisis, it's always tempting to say, just this once, let's give someone the power to fix everything quickly. But history shows us that temporary powers have a way of becoming permanent, and the people who save us from chaos sometimes forget to give the power back. So as you think about the leaders in your own time, in your own country, ask yourself, are they more like the Caesar who crossed the Rubicon claiming to defend the Republic? Or are they the kind of people who would step down when the emergency is over? Because that distinction might be the most important lesson Pharsalus has to teach us. The Roman Republic died so long ago that it feels like ancient history, but the principles it represented, shared power, checks and balances, the idea that leaders serve the people rather than the other way around, those ideas are still fighting for their lives in our world today. That's why this story matters. That's why we need to remember not just the tactics Caesar used to win his great victory, but the price Rome paid for his success. Because somewhere out there, another ambitious leader is making the calculations that could change everything, and the ghost of Pompey is whispering, "Don't make the same mistake we did." If you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's most consequential days, I hope you'll share it with someone who might learn something from Rome's triumph and tragedy. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and drop a comment telling me what you think we can learn from Caesar and Pompey's fateful clash. And hey, if you want more epic tales from the ancient world, stories of ambition and betrayal, of courage and folly, of moments when everything hung in the balance, make sure you subscribe to Imperium Chronicles. We've got so many incredible stories to tell, from the rise and fall of emperors to the battles that shaped civilization itself. Until next time, remember what the Romans used to say when parting ways: "Veil, be strong, be well, and learn from the past so we can build a better future." The story of Pharsalus is over, but the lessons it teaches us are just beginning.